Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. This video is a review and reaction to Horizon: An American Saga Chapter 1, which is the first of Kevin Costner's four-part epic attempt to try and tell multiple stories across the Western landscape, essentially in a sort of modern take on how the West was won, bridging generations and trying to tell the story of the development of the American West. Now, of course, the big story surrounding this is that this is a long-time passion project for Costner, and he sunk a significant portion of his own money into the financing and making of the film, which is, of course, beyond admirable. And I think more people should actually do this and put their money where their mouth is if they have the ability to do so, in order to make films that at least have a point and have passion behind them, and especially considering the exorbitant salaries stars in particular get paid. Obviously the old adage is always never put your own money into a movie, but if you want to really do something, that is the sign of having the ultimate passion for said passion project, and that alone, I think, at least should earn some audience goodwill and attention. But the focus has been on the fact that Costner has spent it's reputedly $38 million of his own money, possibly even more. I think it's been said that it's actually maybe closer to around $50 million of his own money, and has been able to produce the first two parts of this four-part series, and is currently working on the third chapter, trying to get enough financing to finish the third chapter, let alone get to the fourth. So given the first chapter's not so great box office performance so far, it is debatable if this will even get finished, and that is a legitimate concern to think about, and should have been something they thought about in the first place. And I'm not even really going to get into the plot of the film, because I think the overall experience and the production of this film is actually what the focus should be. And I think that is compounded by the fact that the actual plotting and the storyline and virtually every element of this film, in terms of the first chapter we've been given, is so baffling and is unlike anything that has ever come before, in terms of this really sets a new precedent in terms of passion project and epic film storytelling attempts, and actually manages to blur the line further between film theatrical releases and streaming series for television. It really does blur the line even further, especially since there are elements throughout this first film that do very much feel like a television series in every way, shape, and form. So the people who label this essentially a television series, sort of just given the theatrical run and sort of trying to pass itself off as a feature, well, unfortunately, I think there is some validity to that argument. Now, again, this is a long-standing passion project for Costner. He apparently started first tossing around ideas and trying to develop elements of scripts back in the 1980s. And this, of course, was coming off the back of his real career breakthrough in Silverado, with, of course, Lawrence Kasdan, but also Mark Kasdan, who is Lawrence's brother, who helped Costner first develop some script ideas, and that's really why he still has the story credit he does on the current iteration. But that's when this first started. It's unknown whether there was a full script or maybe just outlines or various ideas, and I would love if there was the opportunity to read all the various scripts and previous versions, so you can see how this grew, and I think that would explain a lot of what we're seeing in this film. But essentially, the whole idea started back in the mid to late 80s after Silverado, and Costner has admirably stuck to his proverbial guns and supported the Western genre, which is a very unpopular thing to do. And that's all the more great news for us Western fans who appreciate the art form of the genre, because we need all the help we can get in terms of trying to convince studios and audiences that Westerns are one of the great American art forms. But Costner is also a very He's a very ponderous actor, and that's really, I think, the key to his style, and that's also how he's always directed films or been involved in films as a producer. There's nothing wrong with that, but that means that naturally there's a tendency for the films to be longer and less focused on the plot and drawn out because they're naturally ponderous. I think you'll find this is part of Costner's star persona, and it's throughout all of the films that he had creative input in, and also, especially most of all the films he's directed or produced. So when you look at his various westerns and what he's actually made on the production side, even Dances with Wolves is already a more ponderous study of that particular story and how the tone of the film reflects this. And then, of course, the theatrical version was a bit over 3 hours, and then was expanded to the 4-hour plus version, which became the standard version on home video, starting with the beautiful Laserdisc box set. But that also introduced issues of pacing, and it's still debated on whether or not that is technically the director's cut. But I do think the extended version does have issues of pacing compared to the original theatrical version that was the winner of all the Academy Awards and really gave a shot in the arm to the Western genre. And unfortunately, the theatrical version became supplanted and was unavailable for a great number of years unless you either imported the UK Blu-ray of the theatrical cut or held on to your old video editions. But then also, finally, the Shout Factory rather basic Blu-ray reissue in that steelbook did include a version of the theatrical cut. So at least it's back around now, but even then you can start to see how he was playing around with longer runtimes and how he can throw off the pacing. You also have to look at Horizon with the other major news item and what people are focusing on, which is how Costner exited the Yellowstone series, which was so popular and really had reinvigorated his career. And of course, we don't know what happened, but it's kind of hard not to view making Horizon at this point and how he exited from that series, that there must have been some sort of kerfluffle, if you will. And this is perhaps somebody trying to get their own back a little bit. It may have not gone down that way. Again, none of us were in the room or able to see the negotiations and things, but that was a very popular show, still is, and it's impossible to not sort of read some of that into going off and basically trying to do your own version, even if it was a long-standing passion project. That would be one thing, but of course there's actually a little bit of previous history that suggests that maybe this isn't the first time this has happened. And that, of course, was when Tombstone was in pre-production. It did actually have Kevin Costner attached, but eventually he just left for various reasons, but it seems as if he really just kind of wanted to do his own version, and so he left the Tombstone production and transitioned over into Wyatt Earp and brought on Lawrence Kasdan. And ironically, Tombstone managed to soldier on and recast and everything, and managed to come out first and be incredibly much more successful in both box office and with the public at large, and is still viewed as a genre classic, even though I do think it is very much overrated. And then Wyatt Earp is kind of relegated to the forgotten heap. And also Wyatt Earp is significantly longer and is much more serious and much more ponderous, but also it has the expanded version, which is only in this rare Laserdisc box set. And while this has a lot of good scenes, it also further alters the film's pacing and does have pacing issues of its own. So this is another longer version that is video exclusive that does underline some of the inherent pacing and structural issues of the theatrical cut. Even though this was a film directed by someone else, it does have a lot of Costner's input, because he was basically his baby of sorts and kind of developed from there, and he had a lot of input in it, but it has some of the same reoccurring themes in the production and the style of the film that I think run throughout some of these films I'm highlighting. And then, of course, came Waterworld, which was another film where the whole production and the budget and the production turmoil were all anyone focused on. That's what they were reviewing instead of the film. And then the film kind of got bad-mouthed and not viewed for its own merits, and then has multiple cuts, including the longest cut, which is the Ulysses cut. So that film has pacing issues of its own. And then after that, Costner went and made The Postman, which is essentially a Western in a sort of post-apocalyptic dystopian science fiction guise. It's an interesting hybrid. It's a film with really interesting ideas, but some have labeled it basically him trying to do his own version of what he wanted to do maybe in Waterworld. Again, whether that's true or not, nobody knows, but it's hard to not see those films linked in a certain way, because there are some thematics that are the same. But that film he directed, and I do think it is underrated, but also it has its share of issues, and it is exceptionally too long. It essentially 3 hours. It is far too long. And that, again, unfortunately, keeps this sort of trend going about us having a sort of ponderous length that's not conducive to a plot. And I'm building to a point, because I think this has reached its height in Horizon Chapter 1. But then really, of course, you next jump to Costner's last Western, which of course was Open Range from 2003. And this was the last film that Costner directed before this Horizon project. Open Range is a very solidly made film. It's very underrated. It was not seen and reviewed enough back when it came out, but it did receive good notices and did get good box office, which did prove that the Western could be successful. And like Dances with Wolves and other projects, did have a strong source to work from, whether it be collaborators, but in the case of Open Range, he was working from a well-respected Western novel, so there was a literary source, and I think that gave it some grounding. The film was also striving for realism in terms of its sound design, its production design, and underlining the inherent grit and how difficult it was to eke out a living in the West, even though the story itself was very simple. The film was perhaps maybe a little long, but it was also it remained nicely enough focused on the story it was telling, and the fact that it had a literary novel source did help to ensure that the flow of the plot felt lived in. I think Open Range is one of the few truly well-made and well-executed Westerns of the modern era, without feeling as if it is going too heavily into being a revisionist Western. And I think the fact that it's all done real for the most part, and they actually built the town at considerable expense and strove for period accuracy, and most especially the sound design is absolutely astonishing. I think the film has one of the great 5.1 mixes of the 5.1 era. So it's a film I like to return to. Unfortunately, there's no Blu-ray, and we just have the DVD here in the US, although there are some difficult to find import Blu-rays out there. That was really, I think, one of the last examples of a major Western being released as a full-on studio release with a theatrical run that was relatively successful. There have been a few exceptions after that, but I think Open Range is one of the truly good Westerns of the past 30 years. But then we jump to Horizon Chapter 1, and I was looking forward to this because one can only admire the sheer balls it took to put your own money into this when you knew it was going to be a hard sell at the very least to an audience in 2024, let alone being a multi-part saga of hopefully 4 films. And the way that this has been broken up, Chapter 1 is 3 hours long and is dealing with multiple storylines, and then these are going to be continued in the other parts. I assume in Part 2 is where they're all going to meet up, and then we go from there, and it's supposed to form this essentially one giant multiple hour 4-chapter block of material. But just in the concept alone, it's of course, using the title of chapters is trying to link it to it having a sort of literary feel, like you're reading chapters or sections or novels in a series. But it does very much underline how the whole concept is very much like a modern television or streaming series in particular, and how you can basically play around with the constraints of a 90 minutes to 2 hour feature film, because you don't have those same constraints, and you also don't have the constraints of having each part being locked to television constraints of a 1 hour runtime or a 30-minute runtime. So things are so much more fluid now in terms of not having to strictly go by the constraints of either television for network broadcast or for feature films in terms of runtime and how this is going to play in theaters. So we've had plenty of the lines between the two mediums be blurred, and theaters are themselves struggling, as is the entire film industry. And so with all these various upheavals going on that we're seeing, coming out with this project right now and how it's been executed has unfortunately blurred those lines further. So when you see Horizon, it's impossible to not think of the sort of build up to the project and Costner's past films and how some of those have gone, and also how he exited Yellowstone. But then also it's impossible not to think about where we are in 2024 and how the notion of a streaming series can at times take on aspects of feature films, and how feature films at times can take on aspects of a streaming television series. And it's getting to the point where the only major difference is the platform and the method of viewing, because the lines have gotten so blurred. But I think Horizon has pushed this even further, because when you're sitting in the theater watching this film, there are frequent moments of this seems just like a streaming series. It doesn't necessarily have the scope of a feature film, in spite of the length and the admirable aspects. And that brings me to my major point and why I think this film should be studied, because it's just completely baffling. It is baffling in its execution. That's what's going to keep you awake at night if you're like me and you think about films and you mull over them, and you're in the shower and you're thinking about why did a film have a certain plot structure, or why was this done, or why was this scene put here, or why was the staging of a particular shot a certain way, things like that. If you're like me and you mull over films, this is a film you're going to honestly have to see multiple times, because again, some of the choices made are truly baffling. Again, this is a 3 hour film that is supposed to set up a saga of 4 films and build an audience. And in 2024, most people don't even want to give Westerns a chance. So it's already a hard uphill climb. But it has multiple storylines, and instead of sectioning them out or perhaps telling one storyline at a time in an individual film, the decision was to basically jump back and forth between what is roughly 3 storylines. You could possibly even say that there's maybe even 4 if you wanted to go even further. But essentially, there are 3 distinct storylines, and we jump between all of them, and there's no cohesion. In fact, I would describe it as the scenes just bang together. In fact, it takes you a significant portion of time. It takes a few seconds or a couple minutes sometimes to realize, oh wait, we're in the other storyline now. We're in storyline C now. We're back to storyline A, and it makes you honestly not only pay more attention, but it distracts from the film because it doesn't flow properly. And I understand the idea of wanting to introduce these major storylines and jump back and forth to try and give the sense that this is telling the story of the American West, and there were many different people on many different paths, and while they all have similar goals and ideas, they tell the same story essentially when they're added together. But by jumping around, the idea is to sort of give a overall view of aspects of the building of the West. And again, the link to How the West Was Won is right there. But unfortunately, it seems like some of the wrong lessons were taken from How the West Was Won. That film, of course, is an iconic roadshow. It is one of the only 2 narrative features done in the full 3-panel Cinerama process. And I think as a film, it is perhaps a bit too large in aspects, and but it is trying to be an epic, and it truly is. And the way it handles the overall storylines and sequences is the film is nicely broken up into sections, which each had different directors, and there are a few characters that flow between those sections, and that's what unifies them. And so by the end of the film, there is a sort of coming together moment of all those stories and ideas and all of the themes, in spite of each section being different and having a different director and a different tone and a different setting. By the end, you get that full sense of the multi-generational saga. And so all of what the audience has gone through over the course of this epic roadshow Cinerama experience comes together in that final moment. And it is beautifully done. But it takes a while to get there, but at least it makes sense and it builds upon itself. And Costner's talked about how that film was a enormous influence on him as a child, seeing it in one of the original roadshow engagements. So obviously some of that has echoed in, and that's what seemingly his inspiration was. And you see this film, and if you know How the West Was Won, that's very apparent. And all of this is admirable, but unfortunately somebody didn't quite grasp that the reason why How the West Was Won actually works is that it has the distinct stories and the distinct segments, and they flow into one another, and they don't sit there and mash them all together into a jumbled mess. And I think the best way to describe the plot of Horizon is, again, to go back to how this is very much blurring the lines between television and feature films. It feels as if there were 3, maybe 4 scripts for episodes of a 1-hour streaming series. And it feels as if somebody just sat there and took individual pages out of each of those scripts and just started just mixing them all together until they had one script that was 3 hours of runtime. Because that is the degree of which we just go back and forth between different plot lines. It is truly baffling. It really is disorienting. And it also underlines how the film is very much a sensory experience. It is seemingly designed to try and get to the audience on a sensory level. And this is something that I think you can see in Costner's past Westerns. Even Open Range had a slower, more methodical pace and was all about the difficulties of living in the West and living with oneself and building to the dread felt in the final, very gritty and extremely realistic gunfight. But in Horizon Chapter 1, there's not enough plot development for 3 hours of runtime, especially jumping between the different storylines, which shortchanges all of those storylines. None of them were properly developed, and thus they're not satisfying, and they don't allow the audience to get invested in them, especially when you're jumping back and forth so many times. But it's the sensory quality that starts to wear the audience down. That's what keeps you going in the film, because the film is all about getting the experience of essentially how miserable it was to live in the West and how difficult it was to survive. But this also goes into the fact that not everything is set up. The audience has to be on their toes because there are moments and elements throughout that simply are not established and not set up and not, frankly, properly executed. So you're either left scratching your head a little bit, and then you have to keep thinking about it and not paying attention to what's going on in the film at that time because you're still puzzling over what just happened, and then it suddenly hits you and you're like, Or if you have enough experience with past Westerns, or you read a lot of Western stories, or you've seen all of Costner's past Westerns, you can kind of start to put two and two together and go, oh, okay. For example, there is a sequence where a younger, or a boy essentially, is running away for his life and takes a second horse with him. And this is a night scene, which is also kind of hard to discern what's going on due to the way the film's been photographed digitally and then processed, and then that wasn't helped by the horrible presentation I saw at the local AMC theater, which I'll get into at the end because that's a whole other thing that unfortunately affects this film. But in this sequence, he's being chased by Native American warriors who are part of this raiding party that's attacked and is burning the sort of pioneer tent city at that time of what is to be the titular Horizon. And even that is so not well set up that you don't even realize that that's supposed to be the Horizon town in its sort of first or second iteration until significantly later in the film. But anyway, he's running for his life. He's on horseback, and he's got a second horse with him. And he then eventually jumps onto the second horse and escapes. Well, you may be sitting there wondering, well, why does he have two horses? It's not set up at all. You just suddenly can notice, oh, well, he's leading a second horse with him. But essentially the idea is that he takes a second horse because he knows the first horse he's on is going to get winded and he'll have to switch to the second horse. Otherwise, he's going to be captured and killed. So it's a survival moment. It's a little period detail in terms of historical period detail that is extraordinarily accurate and something that somebody would have had to have done, and shows that even kids in the West had to grow up very quickly and learn how to survive. Brilliant concept, brilliant that it was put in the film. I truly admire that type of period detail. It's also very much an atmospheric detail and something that is very much part of how life in the West was. But you have to set these things up. The film has a great number of these small, subtle moments and details that are fantastic, and these are the best parts of the film. But they're never fully set up, so they never fully crystallize, and they never hit with the weight that they should. But I think that's a particular example that's also kind of confusing to the audience, simply due to how it's executed. And you have to sit there and think about it as the film's going, because the film insists that you stay on your toes, because it's not going to set up elements or the plot or details or allow characters to fully resonate with the audience, because suddenly we'll be back off into the other storyline. And again, there is no linking between the storylines. There's no narrative linking between any of them. We literally just hard cut between all these sequences. The only thing you get at essentially in the first scene of each storyline, when we get to that suddenly, is a generic location caption, and then I think some of them have the rough time frame. And the film, at least in chapter 1, is roughly taking place in the middle of the American Civil War, so it's taking place in about 1862, 1863. But outside of that little location caption in the first scene of the storyline, when we first see a sequence of that storyline, we get a location caption, and it's very disorienting because of how this is just literally jumping into a whole other story that in chapter 1, none of these are really linked to one another. So again, I think the editing is a gigantic problem. It really doesn't work outside of really sort of constantly assaulting the audience on a sensory level. And then I think you have to look at the photography of the film, which also ties into this, again, this sort of assault on the audience's senses, if you will, because the film is all about big images and the difficulties of living in the West and trying to get that lived-in feel. And because of the disorientation of having such a jumbled plot of jumping between the different storylines without having any sense of narrative cohesion, the photography unfortunately magnifies some of these issues, because the entire film is mostly shot in close shots. There's a lot of close-ups, but most of the shots, if you actually examine them, they're quite close. There's not a whole lot of the American landscape, ironically, in Horizon. And when you actually get a true wide shot or a low angle shot where we suddenly get skies with clouds, it's actually a bit of a relief, and you're suddenly like, oh wow, yeah, I forgot where we were. And also because everything is shot so relatively close, it not only, again, makes the film feel more like a streaming television series shot on a more limited budget and production schedule, but also television shows have always naturally been less epic and landscape usage, of course, and also they have less of the feature film feel, and for lack of a better term. So you would expect for a 3-hour film literally called Horizon to be filled with epic shots of the landscape, and at least have moments that felt like what we saw in Dances with Wolves or even Open Range, because same people involved and we have the same cinematographer as Open Range. But it's quite surprising how the photography of the film really doesn't achieve the sense of grandeur that we even come to expect in B westerns or all of the great westerns, which had an innate knowledge of the landscape, even if they were entirely shot on a studio backlot and never went into a real location. So it's striking how kind of simplistic and much more like a streaming series most of the photography is. And I think it very much has to do with how the staging is done. And also, to go back to the notion of how the film has a sort of disorienting effect, the staging of a lot of the shots is kind of confusing to the audience, because it's very difficult at times to get a sense of the actual visual landscape of a shot, and thus it's hard to know exactly what the parameters are of the location they're in. And all of this is because it's always framed so close. And they also utilize the 1.85 to 1 ratio instead of going for an anamorphic format. And also, this film was shot digitally. It was shot, I believe, roughly at about a 6K raw digital format and finished as a 4K digital intermediate. But this means it does have a very modern look in terms of the overall imagery. It doesn't have the sort of timeless quality of Dances with Wolves or even Open Range. But also it has some of the tendencies of modern digital photography and also modern digital color grading. So there are, I think, some of even the colors that appear a bit too visually striking. And I think had this been actually shot on film as Open Range was, I think that would have made an enormous difference. And it kind of makes me question why there were certain decisions like this made that almost feel like it's kind of shortchanging the whole concept of this. And if you were going to put your own money into making this, obviously it costs more to shoot on film, but one would hope that all of the production side of things could have been at a sort of uniform level, and especially with the film consistently trying to echo and reference the classic westerns of the past that it's building upon. But then you'll also notice that throughout the film there are a number of shots that are quite soft looking in areas and have sections of the frame that seem off somehow. And then there's also moments where you'll notice a sort of patina of what at first seems like digital noise and at other times seems like film grain. And for a film that's shot digitally, you would then wonder, oh, well, did they perhaps do what a lot of productions do in the modern age of trying to achieve a sort of film look by adding in a grain plate or something to more approximate film grain to give a sort of texture in the image, or again, to harken back to a more classical Western look, which that's something that's very commonplace. Well, actually, the truth is that they went much further than that, and they employed a modern practice that's starting to attain some level of vogue and interest because it's been used on a number of summer tentpole films, such as I think the Batman used this, and also both of the Dune films have used this, and that's the analog intermediate process. And this was something that I wasn't even aware of, and I had to actually go and do some research, and because I was quite shocked that this was a thing. And essentially, what this process is, normally when a film print is made of a modern film, because everything is edited digitally anyway, they take the digital intermediate and then they print that out to film. So they basically make a film copy, and then there are some prints struck from that, and that's what you get for film prints of modern films. And for me, that just kind of defeats the point. I don't think there's really a point to having a modern film print of something unless it was shot and finished on film. But anyway, at least the concept is solid, and making a film out, as it's called, is also the ultimate means of archival preservation, because a film print properly stored can last about a century, whereas digital storage in archival terms is very dicey and also a giant problem in the industry that they don't like to talk about. But at least the concept of a film out makes sense. But an analog intermediate is basically making a film out of your digital intermediate and then scanning that film source back in and then working off of that to give a quote-unquote film look. And what that does is also introduce generational loss, and it's also dependent on the film stock and how well the print was made. And also modern film stocks try to approximate digital photography as much as possible, so they don't have the aesthetics of older film stocks. That's really what they're trying to emulate. So essentially what this process does is it makes your film worse. And it's basically reducing the visual quality in a misguided attempt to try and emulate a sort of film aesthetic. And it's a much better idea, if you're trying to have some sort of aesthetic like that, to work at it from the digital realm. And the greatest example would be the Holdovers recently, really trying to achieve, in particular, aesthetics of the 1970s in how they chose their lenses and what light sources they used for the lighting and how they staged some of the photography, but especially in the digital realm, how they handled the overall color timing, the approach they took to trying to generate a sort of film grain texture. And so that is a good example of somebody trying to emulate film aesthetics in the digital realm with care and attention, but also not actually doing the unbelievably stupid and dumb move of making a film copy of your digital source and then working off of that and thinking that's a good idea. And I do think this manifests in the digital screenings that you're going to see, which are only in 2K, because there are moments throughout that look soft and look off and look a little bit weird. Especially, I noticed a number of them in one of the storylines where we have Kevin Costner and others riding through some beatific forests, and especially when you have all the rows of trees and all of the greenery in the background, this process seems to have played around with the focus and the depth of field, and I kept noticing that those shots in particular looked frequently weird all throughout the backgrounds and all of the natural landscape, when they should look rock solid and absolutely beautiful. But once I realized this process had been used, it started to explain a lot of things. So what was a completely digital shoot that had its own, color filters generated and its own particular editing process has then been printed out to film and then scanned back. So that's introduced all of, I think, these visual quirks. And honestly, it's a very stupid idea. If you wanted a film look for real, you should have just shot on film in the first place, like most productions do now, of shooting on some sort of film stock or using a particular process and then capturing that and then doing everything else digitally. That's what you have to do ultimately if you want to have a film aesthetic or experiences. You have to do all of the work on the front end and actually shoot on film. But of course, that also is much more expensive and it takes a lot more time. And another thing with Horizon is that apparently it was shot in only 52 days. And 52 days for a gigantic multi-storyline film that is 3 hours long it's not a lot of time. And as Costner says in interviews, he shot Dances with Wolves for roughly 106 days. And that was a much more limited scope film. It was much more focused. And that was also entirely on film. So I think it explains some of the further issues with Horizon, that they did it so quickly, and it also, again, makes it feel more like a television streaming series because they didn't necessarily have the time to mount things that are so big and expansive. And if you listen to some of the interviews, you even hear reference that they didn't take as much time to set up the photography and set up the lighting because they had to move quickly, and that it was thought that the story was the key and the script was the key, and that's all that really mattered. And well, yes, at the end of the day, that's what matters, but you don't rush the photography because you're just trying to meet hard deadlines because you're shooting a 3-hour film with huge scope and multiple storylines. So again, this shortchanges all of the material. There are still some bigger set pieces, the big one being the sort of sacking and burning of the Horizon city when it's in tent form. But that goes on for quite a long while, and while there's some really nice subtle moments scattered throughout, even that's subdivided into individual moments and set pieces because we're also cutting to a family barricading themselves inside the house and trying to defend themselves. So that's basically a miniature sequence inside the main sequence, and then we lose all concept of the burning of the whole settlement, and then it jumps back and forth. And so it's even disorienting even inside of the big set piece sequence in the same way that it is throughout the rest of the film, where it's just banging into individual scenes and disorienting the audience by jumping between the storylines. There is a good usage of practical effects, which is very impressive. Again, especially the burning of the big grouping of tents and some of the landscape shots that you get, and it'll always give a thrill to an audience to see a beautifully staged shot of just a man riding horseback into the open range. I mean, that's one of the most iconic images in all of the visual medium. But there's also CG scattered throughout. I mean, there are digital effects in this film, and I think they do stick out, and they are a bit distracting, and they do certainly take me out of the experience. And again, one would wish for such a big passion project that not only would they have actually shot it on film, but they would have done everything reel for reel. I know that's asking a lot. That would take a lot of time and obviously cost more money. But if you were very creative with how you spent money and you prepared very well, this should at least have the visual style or the visual impact of Open Range or Dances with Wolves. And there are some subtle moments that do underline that this is still the same guy behind those films. And again, the subtle moments are the best parts of the film. But the digital effects really do kind of mar the experience as well, because I think the Western really is the ultimate genre that needs to be done reel for reel, especially if you're going to incredible locations. Another element that continues to perplex and I think make it hard to want to criticize the film, even though it's got so many various issues. All the performances are good, I think, across the board. I think everyone is great, except the effectiveness of their performance is undercut because they all get shortchanged, because none of the stories are allowed to develop, and we constantly go from one to another because the way that the film is I mean, I hate to even use the word structured, because there is no structure, because the scenes literally just bang together. But everybody gets shortchanged. So I think all the performances are good. I think some of the individual moments are good. And the ones you remember are usually the smaller ones where we kind of stop and focus for a minute at the very least. But because we're just already disoriented and trying to keep up with what's going on and going between all the different storylines, none of the performances achieve the resonance that they should. And again, all the performances are great. So it's shortchanging the actors just like the story's getting shortchanged. And that brings me to my other point, which is essentially I've been trying to figure out how this could have been better implemented had it felt like, somebody had a plan. For lack of a better term, how could these storylines and various ideas and moments, and also how could the budget have been better allocated, essentially? Because it looks as if all of our storylines and characters are going to intersect at the third storyline, which is the story of the wagon train going west, ostensibly to the city that's being advertised everywhere of the great American dream, in the city of Horizon itself. And I guess in chapter 2, we're going to have at least one, if not both, of the other storylines intersect with the wagon train storyline, which is the least developed and has the least runtime in chapter 1. But that's sort of the bridging element. Well, if you look at how the films were produced, the budget of Chapter 1 and 2, which are the finished Horizons, is about $100 million. And if you go and look at the budget of Open Range, that was $22 million. And if you adjust it for inflation, now currently that would be about $35 million. So since you have 3 storylines, I think a much better approach would have been you have to make sure each film stands on its own and is focused and has a good story that's involving, and you have to build your audience as you go, because nobody's going to want to go through 4 films if they don't care about the first one, and the overall negative reception and box office of this first chapter does not bode well for the films to come. But I think it would have been a much better idea to start with well-crafted, more focused films telling one of the storylines. That would set the stage for what you're trying to do, and then you flow into the second film telling the second storyline, and you maybe have some characters move in between. Essentially, this is like breaking up the sections of How the West Was Won into their own individual features, with a similar sort of runtime and focus as Open Range, because a Western needs energy, it needs narrative focus most of all. It needs narrative focus and energy more than any other genre in motion pictures. But had we had individual focus and films that stood on their own that also had linkages to one another, so they flowed into one another, you essentially are building your audience with each film. And then on the fourth film, you could go bigger and have everything fully intersect. And then when viewed as a whole, it is a true sort of sweeping feel of a saga. That's just one approach you could take. But if you did that with a similar sort of budget as Open Range had, you essentially could have made 3 films for what they spent on 2 films. I know it's maybe not as much of the epic saga that Costner was going for in doing it that way, but I think that's a much more practical way to do something this big with this many storylines, and also having to build your audience and make your dollar go as far as it could. And because each of the individual films would be smaller and more focused and more effective, and I think better received, you could also spend more time on the production schedule and craft them better, and also shoot them on film. And you could make your dollar go further, and thus you're not shortchanging the stories and the performances and the overall story you're trying to tell. And then years down the road, when most people are going to be viewing this at home on a streaming platform, which seems the sort of ultimate destination for everything now, that's how they're going to be viewed, as a complete whole. Anyway, that's just a particular theory I've come up with because I've been pondering over this ever since I saw it, and just how the approach has been made. And I think one can only come back to the idea that it seems as if the reason why this is being done right now is that enough things lined up, and they essentially got the green light that they could go and do this. And so Costner exited Yellowstone and put his own money into it, and you just get the sense that they went off half-cocked. It's an admirable project, don't get me wrong, and admirable that he put his own money in and essentially put his money where his mouth was, and I think that's reason enough to go and see this, because it does have nice moments gathered throughout, which it's not something you necessarily see in modern releases in chain theaters in the U.S., but it's just it's not the satisfying experience it should be. It's admirable in ways, but for every admirable aspect, I'd say there's about 10 or 20 mistakes or things that could have been done better, or things that are distracting or disorienting, or just it's like for every good thing there's multiple things that hold it back. And I just feel that it needed more of a gestation time for how they were producing the script. The script itself was reworked from the last time Costner tried to do this after Open Range, and basically Disney said no, and so then it went back on the back burner again. So this isn't just a new project out of nowhere, but what we're getting is essentially a modern take on this long gestating project that's been produced after Costner getting into television work, starting with the Hatfields and McCoys miniseries and then Yellowstone and other things. So it has taken on the air of having more of the feel of a television miniseries. And again, that blurs the line further between TV and feature films. And I do think it actually would play better as a streaming series. That's what it seems to be designed for. So I think that criticism a lot of people are leveling at it is unfortunately spot on. There are moments that have at least some of the feel of a feature film's grandeur, but it's nothing compared to even Open Range or especially Dances with Wolves, although there are moments that show it's still the same person behind all three of those films. And there's also the fact that it's referencing and echoing themes and elements and moments from classic Westerns, but usually in a sort of indirect way. They're just kind of there. In particular, the opening shot of the film has an anthill, and distressingly, those seem like CG ants. They don't even look like they're real ants. But that, of course, is directly referencing the opening shot of the Wild Bunch. But here in Horizon, it's just a shot of an anthill and some ants. There's no real point to it. Whereas in the Wild Bunch, we have it developed that children are putting the scorpions in the nests of ants and watching the scorpions being eaten alive and torn to shreds and enjoying the process and poking them with sticks before eventually setting all of them on fire. So that little moment in the Wild Bunch sears itself into the audience's brain, and in the context of that film is symbolic of the whole film. And so I think the very obvious referencing of the Wild Bunch in the opening shot of Horizon Chapter 1 is a very, in some ways, it's kind of reflective of how the overall film experience is a bit empty, because that it's just there. There's nothing tying it to the overall film. There's no meaning other than the fact that it's again kind of reflective of how the whole film experience has a certain emptiness to it. So that one reference right there is the first shot without context or meaning. It kind of makes you wonder why it's there, and then the only inference you can make is that that's a reference to the opening of the Wild Bunch, but there's no point other than that it's a nod. There are other echoes throughout. Of course, there's plenty of echoes of John Ford, particularly in the cavalry sections of the film. That's of course very reminiscent of Ford's iconic Cavalry trilogy. But there's also moments in that section that also I think kind of suggest masterpieces like Olzana's Raid, or even some sections that almost remind one of Geronimo, An American Legend, which is one of the few really adult, intelligent westerns since the real collapse of the genre, and that, of course, was in the 90s when very few westerns were being made. But then there are moments that also seem as if they're trying to reference other classical westerns, or the westerns of Anthony Mann or Bud Boetticher, or various other nods sort of scattered throughout, and of course more allusions to Peckinpah, but also with the feeling of Costner's past westerns. But all of the echoes and nods, while you may pick up on some, and some are just sort of trying to achieve a similar feeling, they have a certain hollowness to them because they don't really achieve anything. It's nice that they're there, but it just has the unfortunate side effect of reminding you of all of these masterworks of the form that you could be watching instead. So yeah, it sort of underlines there's a hollowness to the overall experience, I think. Not everyone's going to pick up on these, but and it's nice that they're there and that there are obviously nods scattered throughout. But also it ties the film back again to How the West Was Won, in that having all these nods and echoes and having pieces of the story sort of echo iconic westerns of the past, it makes it feel like it's trying to summarize the western and thus be big in scope and scale while not having the plot focus and thus the resonance. And How the West Was Won has some of that inherent. So that film, as iconic and classic as it is, it has some issues of its own for how big and expansive it's trying to be. It's never as effective as it could be, and it's also a sort of sanitized version of the West. And in some ways, I think Horizon is kind of mirroring a lot of what How the West Was Won did, because it's trying to. I think it's obviously the impetus for this whole project in the first place. But it's essentially repeating some of the same mistakes, just in different ways. Ironically, a lot of these things I'm talking about actually remind me of another modern Western that I think has some certain similarities. That's actually Red Dead Redemption 2, which has a similarly very drawn-out storyline, but the issue with Red Dead Redemption 2 was the fact that you knew where the story was going from the opening act, and then had to wait a substantial amount of time to get there. Plus, the story was already a prequel to the first game, so you already knew what fate befell certain characters. It was just expanding upon the world here in the sequel. But in spite of sort of jumping around in time a little bit and having different locales and set pieces, and being far too drawn out in terms of not maintaining plot focus, and the audience, getting more sidetracked into the very side quest and the elements of the world, it did similarly try to achieve a degree of realism. It did so to such a degree that was remarkable, but it also distracted from the actual story. But the story is more consistent than what we have in Horizon, because in spite of its excessive length and being a prequel, it at least is consistent in its storytelling and how the story is being doled out. And also, I think it properly is at least timed to match the sort of intentional extended pace, because the pace is slowed down to a minimum, and things are slowly revealed over time. And this is all tied into the game's overall concept of trying to show how miserable life in the West was. So there are some similarities with what Horizon is trying to do, but Horizon Chapter 1 is nowhere near as effective in integrating all of these as Red Dead Redemption 2 was, even though I still think this is a very disappointing game in terms of the actual story and how it's essentially how it's modulated. Because for me, I think the first game, Red Dead Redemption, is probably the best Western anybody's made since Sam Peckinpah's Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid in 1973. I think that first game is truly remarkable for its blending of styles and tones, having a consistent story with a real gut punch of an ending. And managing to carve out its own unique niche by blending the styles together into its own identifiable style that also makes the nods and the echoes of iconic Westerns invisibly blended into the storyline, so us Western geeks can see them, but they don't distract from the story, and it doesn't just make you think of the masterpiece film you could go be watching instead. And in spite of how many issues are inherent in Horizon Chapter 1, I still find myself admiring it in certain ways. I think it's always going to be admirable to make such a large-scale Western in a time where the genre is viewed as extraordinarily outdated and not popular at all, and putting your own money into it and actually going out there and making it and trying to make it this big multi-feature saga that is incredibly big and expansive. That is beyond admirable, and I think that in and of itself is why people should go and see this and support this kind of work. But I just wish it had been done where at least there was a sense that more planning went into it on the front end, and I wish that they had actually not gone for this structural idea that really links it more in line with a streaming television series. I would love to be able to read the various older scripts and see how it was going to be mounted, say, for example, back when it was going to be done for Disney. But in any case, a Western needs energy, it needs a strong story and plot focus, it needs drive. And I think that could have been achieved in making well-crafted, smaller films that fit into one another, at least on the scale and in the style of Open Range, on a similar budget, so you could afford doing those, and building into one another to then have the fourth film. And so all four films then fit all together like they were chapters in a book, which is the whole idea that they're going for. There's good stuff in this film, but for everything that's good, there's multiple things that drag it down or hold it back or seem like, frankly, bad ideas. And I think that, again, is tied into how the film was produced, and sort of you just get the sense that they're kind of rushing into it, and especially shooting it in only 52 days. For such a big, expansive film, and the disorientation factor of just jumping in between the different storylines and having scenes just bang together, and everything being shot very close and not really giving you a sense of visual scope and letting the audience get the visual geography throughout. There's a lot of production things that do have it feeling more in line with the television series. So you keep coming back to how this is really blurring the lines and muddying the water between feature film and streaming series even more. So when this arrives in the home on UHD and Blu-ray and streaming, I think it's actually going to play better. It just doesn't seem like it's always designed for the feature constraints. And then how the film ends is suddenly going into a unannounced montage of scenes from the next chapter, which is due out in August. So it's essentially trying to show you the bits to come, like it's a hype reel for the rest of the TV season that's going to come out. And this is just the pilot episode, or this is what's coming up on the next episode. So again, that sort of underlines this continual not having a distinct line between what is a streaming series or television and what is a feature film. It will be interesting to see where this goes in Chapter 2. And again, I do think this is an enterprise that people should support because it is something that nobody else is doing. And the Western needs all the help it can get in terms of proving that it is a viable genre and it is the great American art form, and it does need to be rediscovered. But in the case of Horizon, it's obviously promoting the Western, that's beyond admirable, but it's also not helping the Western in terms of how the general populace is going to view the genre. They already view it as old and outdated and slow and dudes on horses with big mustaches and carrying guns and basically what they've experienced from modern Westerns, also sort of doubling down on those aspects, and it already being a hard sell as a genre in 2024 with a limited audience. You also have to keep in mind that you've got to make it play for audiences, and having the first film right out of the gate be a very disorienting and frequently slow 3-hour film that jumps between different storylines that are not all properly executed or fulfilling, it's really limiting your audience who's going to come back for Chapter 2, because already not many people have showed up for Chapter 1. But I think we're going to see a whole sea change when this actually arrives in the homes, because people are much more forgiving in terms of what they allow in a streaming series or watching at home. And I do think the overall reception is actually going to be better when it arrives on streaming or physical media releases, because it plays differently in the home. And I think the way this project has been done, I do think the overall best delivery method, if you will, the overall best home for it is actually going to be watching at home. It doesn't seem to really have been fully designed for the theatrical release. Intermission and display change. Still talking about Horizon Part 1 and thinking about Horizon Part 1 because it's just that baffling. And then, of course, we come to how the film is being presented in theaters nationwide. And this is the other gigantic problem, which underlines just how bad theaters are in terms of your average chain theater in and across the entirety of the United States. Even major markets and major cities don't have the greatest theaters, but those are usually at least a bit better in terms of how they're run, because there's obviously more people around more regularly, and they're usually closer to either the corporate office or the scrutiny of the corporate office. So one can only imagine the quality in, say, a theater in New York or Los Angeles compared to a theater in the middle of nowhere, or a theater where that's the only major theatrical option for people because it's their only real theater. And since the digital changeover, most chains eliminated any sort of technical personnel or theater staff or projectionists. Everything is pretty much automated, whether it's done on-site or at a certain point or done off-site. And I myself have worked in a variety of different theaters, both chain and independent, over the years. And myself, I have actually avoided seeing a standard 2K screening of any film, really since Mission Impossible 6. And that was a really poor experience. So since then, I've only been going to art houses and film print screenings and screenings in various Dolby cinemas, which are exclusively licensed to AMC, who is the biggest chain nationwide and is owned by a foreign company and also bought up a bunch of other chains. So they have the vast majority of screens nationwide and absolutely zero care about films and zero quality control. But at least in a Dolby cinema, that's the only way you're guaranteeing yourself at least a baseline of quality, because you're supposed to be getting a dual stacked 4K projection with Dolby proprietary technology. You're supposed to be getting the Dolby Atmos system to experience the best possible in sound and sound design, and the theaters are built to a certain standard. It's basically sort of mixing various technologies with the ideas that were promoted with the old THX spec standard that auditoriums had to be built to in the 80s and 90s to get that certification. It's nowhere near as stringent as those were, but at least it's something. And if you're going to see a film digitally projected, in this day and age, it really has to be Dolby Cinema or nothing in terms of trying to get some level of quality, because the sad truth is even someone with an average setup at home with an average middle-of-the-road television has a better experience and and better technical quality than the vast majority of theaters nationwide. Going to an independent theater or a smaller chain theater does at least guarantee you a little bit more quality control, usually, because there's more people involved, and you might actually have people who care about the theatrical presentation of films, but unfortunately, chains are not really interested in that. And with the industry continuing to get worse, that lack of care just keeps going because their focus is elsewhere. When the one thing that theater chains should be doing is focusing on the presentation of films to try and lure people back, because it's the one thing they really have control over. But they don't seem to grasp this concept. So essentially the point I'm trying to get to is I saw this film at a local AMC theater. I had to go to the newer one, so it's a theater that's only a couple years old. It does have a Dolby Hall in it, but the Dolby Halls are always booked up for the latest tentpole, and they don't usually allow it to switch between anything other than the biggest tentpole. And Horizon Chapter 1 has already been designated a box office failure anyway, with a very limited audience. So regardless of what chain theater you're going to, it's not in the biggest hall. It's usually relegated to the smallest hall, which usually gets the least amount of attention and has the least quality of what little quality there is. So I searched everywhere, and ultimately, also due to the fact that there aren't as many showtimes, and they're kind of weird because it is a 3-hour film plus all of the trailers and the tons of commercials, it's, they're not treating it very well. So no matter where you go, you're going to be stuck in the smallest hall with the smallest screen, with probably the least amount of care put into is the presentation actually correct. And also, this is a film in 1:8:5, and it should be much easier to project that. And also, you're not getting the benefit of hearing the film's Dolby Atmos sound design, which was what I was most looking forward to. Again, these are the people behind Open Range, which has one of the great 5.1 mixes. And you get a few fleeting moments that make you think of the great sound design in Open Range. So I'll have to wait to get the film on UHD to actually experience the sound properly, because all you're getting in standard theaters everywhere nationwide is basically the watered down version, either in 5.1 or 7.1 or whatever the theater is configured for. But anyway, it should be a relatively simple film to project properly, even in the standard 2K DCP. And I went to an AMC location that is one of their flagships in the area. It's one of the newest builds, and it's in their full modern style. So it has the full-on uncomfortable recliner seats and larger amount of foot space and everything. So it's not like it's one of the theaters they bought up and have let run into the ground that has holes in the ceilings and it's falling apart. So again, you would think that you would at least get a relatively decent presentation. This is 2024. This is also AMC, and this is also a film that nobody really cares about in terms of it's not the theater's focus, and everyone's already kind of decided that it doesn't have much of an appeal, and it has a limited audience, and it's longer. So what I was confronted with, and again, keep in mind this is a 1:8:5 film, I walked in, and when the film started, there was pillar boxing on the sides of the screen. So we had dead space on the sides of the screen, essentially pillar boxing the image, because most theaters now have a constant image height screen, and they don't bother with masking anymore because that's just too much. It's too much for them to bother with, even if they had automated masking. Oh no, can't do that. So there was exposed sides of the screen, pillar boxing the image, and the image itself had horrible keystoning. So it actually had the awful keystoning type effect that you get when you don't set a data projector right, and you see somebody giving a PowerPoint in like a boardroom meeting or a classroom with that awful keystoning effect, and they didn't even bother to try to mess with it. So for 3 hours, I had to stare at Horizon Chapter 1 with bad keystoning and pillar boxing on the sides, so that made the keystoning even more apparent, and it was also kind of adding distortion. And if that wasn't bad enough, as is usual in almost every theater you go to in this country, the image was very dim, as if the bulb was about to go or it had been turned down significantly. And then, of course, the image was frequently murky, and a lot of the nighttime sequences were at points impossible to follow because the digital photography and the way they were shot combined with the incredibly poor projection and presentation, which is an AMC hallmark, because they make movies worse. If you can't tell, I have a long history of problems with AMC, who is the absolute worst of the worst and the bottom of the barrel in terms of theater chains and having zero presentation quality. But the nighttime scenes in particular were incredibly difficult to follow, but the whole film was made incredibly unpleasant due to just how bad the visuals were. And on top of that, the poor projection and the poor visual quality, I think, made some of the inherent softness and noise and stuff from the analog intermediate process stand out even more. So honestly, I don't know if I can fully say that I could actually appreciate or evaluate what the visual quality of the film was. So just as with the sound, which I'll talk about next, I really think I have to rewatch the film at home on the UHD that Warner Brothers is about to come out with, just to be able to say that I can now properly evaluate the visuals and the sound, because the theatrical presentation quality is so poor that it really mars the experience. And I feel that it compromised the visuals to such a degree that I think I have to rewatch it at home just to get a better idea, just to make sure that I saw everything. And if this were not bad enough, then you go to the sound. Of course, no Dolby Atmos, because that is locked to Dolby Cinemas, which AMC bought the license for, so nobody else can have a Dolby Cinema. So again, I'll have to wait till the UHD release and rewatch the film at home to be able to fully study and appreciate the sound design. I will say that I did notice, at the very least, what came through in the terrible presentation at AMC was that the gunshots were mixed very loud, just as they were in open range. So that was one thing I was looking for. That was an attempt at realism in open range that they have reprised here. But it was very difficult to even get into the sound design and look for things and evaluate the sound experience, because, again, it wasn't the Atmos mix, so it's essentially the watered-down version. And even though there were plenty of speaker arrays along the walls to give enough of a channel spread, some of them seemed as if they were going out or had already gone out. There were several points where there were some sound pans that literally cut out and just banged behind you because they literally jumped defective speaker channels, essentially. But also, the film has a lot of quiet moments. It's a 3-hour Western with a lot of intimate moments sprinkled throughout. It's not a consistently loud for loudness sake film, but most modern films are, even if they're your average comedy or something. So all the theaters adjoining this hall, there's not really any sound baffling between the walls per se. So if you have even a moderately loud film, there's going to be massive bleed through. And of course there was. So consistently for the 3 hours, which ruined all of the quiet and subtle scenes because it was so distracting, you had all of this low frequency effects and even just noise in general, just reverberating through the walls and just booming in. And it was particularly because this was at the end of the hall, so it was only on the right side of the screen in the auditorium where this was all leaking through. So wherever you see this, you're going to run into problems like this, and that's only going to affect your overall appreciation of the film, whether you like it or not. So unfortunately, Horizon Chapter 1 is going to really lay bare all of the gigantic presentation and quality control problems in theaters nationwide, because it's not being given Dolby Cinema runs. It's not being shown in most places with 4K projection. It's being put in their smallest, cheapest, and least well-equipped halls. You're not getting to hear the Dolby Atmos mix, and you're seeing a basic 2K presentation with all of the issues and problems and just glaring drawbacks of movie theaters in the United States in 2024. And I myself don't know any good theater around for just standard presentations. Even the older halls in my market that were built incredibly well in the 90s, or even theaters dating back to the 80s that are still around being operated by chains. I mean, they've been run into the ground, or the halls have been torn apart or basically split or the old term was twinned, but they've been manipulated, or if they've been left alone, I've seen modern presentations there where it's just a shadow of its former self because there's no quality control, there's no care about the presentation, and I knew it was bad, but it had been a while since I had seen a standard 2K presentation in a standard average theater. But I mean, I knew it was bad, and I had had some bad experiences and heard things since, but I had been avoiding seeing a standard 2K presentation. But I didn't realize just quite how bad it had gotten. And again, this is one of the flagship theaters in my market, and I do live around a major city, so it is a relatively major market, and it is actually near or nearer some of the corporate offices of some of the chains. So that's really appalling. And so when Chapter 2 comes around, which I will go see just to support the venture and just to see where this goes out of curiosity, I'm going to have to roll the dice and choose a theater and drive out of my way and pay 2 or 3 times as much just in the hopes that the presentation might be better, because I'm probably going to have to go to one of our Regals, which is more expensive, and then figure out if one of the showtimes work, because again, the showtimes are very iffy on these longer films that are deemed to not have enough market appeal and put in the smallest theater halls. But essentially, if people saw what their films were being presented like in theaters, they probably wouldn't make the film in the first place because it's that bad. If Kevin Costner walked into any theater in the country showing Horizon American Saga Chapter 1, any average theater, for the most part, that is a chain theater. Again, independent theaters, art houses, and smaller chains do a phenomenal job, usually with what resources they have, and they do the best that they can. And even smaller chains usually have more of a level of quality control than your chain theaters. So I encourage people, if you have an independent theater, an art house, or a smaller chain, please go support those over chain theaters, unless you're lucky enough to have a Dolby Cinema location in your area. But if Kevin Costner walked into any average theater, saw what Horizon Chapter 1 looked like, being put in the smallest theater halls with zero quality control, zero care about the presentation, he'd blow his top, and rightly so. But unfortunately, you can't get the industry to actually care about the presentation of films, let alone what they look like in terms of home video mastering and mastering for streaming services. But unfortunately, not only does this film seem much more like a streaming television series and seem more suited for viewing at home and just how it was produced and ultimately finalized, technically you will get a better presentation in the home by it's not even a gigantic margin. It simply is better in every single way, unless you're beyond lucky and somehow your local Dolby Cinema location actually was showing Horizon Chapter 1. That's the only thing that's going to compete with the home. And if you're watching a UHD at home, you're also getting the benefit of HDR, which theaters can't really do in the same way. And the home theaters of today do have a version of Dolby Atmos. It's not as expansive as a Dolby Cinema, but you can actually listen to the Atmos mix at home, and the UHD is coming out soon. And once you add in the cost of, going to the theater, spending the time, gas money, if you get concessions, taxes, convenience fees, all that stuff, it really defies logic to go and see a horrendously bad 2K presentation of a film rather than wait a couple weeks and spend about the same, sometimes even less, for the UHD, even though it's coming from Warner, so it's probably going to have crappy compression and HDR10 only and be a bit bare bones. At least it's going to be better across the board than what 99% of people are seeing in the crap theaters of 2024. So that's another issue. And unfortunately, I can't say that I recommend seeing the film theatrically in terms of the presentation quality, because the presentation quality that most people are seeing is utter crap. And that was vividly displayed in the horrendously bad AMC presentation that I saw, which once again reminded me of how much I dislike their practices and how they don't care about films or the presentation of films. and really are the bottom of the barrel because they are the biggest corporation, and they'll sell you a membership, but that's a membership to see films with absolutely piss poor quality. And again, if people actually saw what most people were seeing their films like in average theaters, they'd be punching holes in the wall and going to the corporate office of the theater going, what the hell, man? So yeah, that was truly awful, and I know others have had similar experiences or said that their experiences were okay, but again, everybody's just seeing this in the smaller halls. It's not being given any sort of prominence because it's an independent film. Technically, it's a 3-hour Western, so I think most theaters think that only people who watched Yellowstone or older people who like Westerns are going to show up for like maybe a matinee on a Sunday or something, and that's not fair. And also, at the very least, when you buy your ticket, you should get a base level of quality. I think nowadays you're just lucky if the film starts, and you're lucky if the image is relatively centered on the screen. That's about it. That's all you can count on at a standard chain theater. That's where we're at, and that is the biggest reason why movie theaters are dying, is because the one thing that they have over the homes and the one thing that they can actually control and do something about, they don't care to. And you literally see the quality of presentation decline. And that does mar Horizon Chapter 1. It will mar people's reactions to it, again, whether you like it or not. And I'm only bringing this up due to how it's being exhibited everywhere, and it was shot in, I think, primarily 6K resolution and finished as a 4K digital intermediate, so it should at least have some 4K options. It should have had some options in Dolby Cinema locations, but you're at the mercy of chain theaters who don't care about presentation quality whatsoever. So to try and summarize all of this, Horizon is a film that is unbelievably flawed and had so many odd, strange, baffling decisions made in its final conception in this form and its execution and how it was produced, and making the 4 films of randomly mixed, interconnected stories that aren't connected at all, and shooting it digitally and then tossing it out in theaters. It's such a strange process to study that I think this is a film that should be studied in film schools. Film schools rarely, if ever, talk about films that aren't successful or had issues or were, reaching for incredible goals, but maybe didn't necessarily get there all the time. So I think in the years to come, this will be a whole project that will be analyzed and studied, if not by film schools, because most aren't really worth their salt. At least it will be analyzed and discussed to death online. There's really not a precedent for somebody going to this length to realize a long-held project and then implementing it in this particular way. And it also, again, has blurred the lines between streaming series or television series and feature film to such a degree that I think this has pushed us further into a world where mass media in terms of motion pictures or television is just one giant thing, and the lines dividing series and feature films, they've kind of been eroded, and ultimately everything's going to wind up on a streaming service or viewed in the home instead of a theater, and theaters will continue to just cater to just the biggest studio tentpole event films. So it is indicative, I think, of where film and television production and the industries are at in 2024. So it's very much locked to this particular time, and when studied in the future, I think that's going to be quite apparent. But it's also interesting because we don't know if this is going to get finished. Costner is currently trying to shoot part 3 and actually get enough financing to finish part 3, let alone get to part 4. He was going around the Cannes Film Festival literally asking billionaires for financing. So again, the big takeaway is you're looking more at the production and the scale of it than the actual film itself. The actual film is like the last of importance. It's the thing you think about least, because you're going in, and just due to the audacity of somebody putting their own money in and trying to make 4 large-scale westerns in 2024. They're supposed to flow together and supposed to be released in relative succession and build on each other, and insisting that they go out in theaters. You just admire that whole idea, and somebody literally putting their money where their mouth is and putting the money down and going and doing it, whether it's going to work or not. So you want Kevin Costner and this whole enterprise to succeed. And I think all of us will go back for chapter 2, but I know not every audience member will go back for chapter 2, because I think a lot of people were very confused and perplexed and thrown off by this first film, which is understandable. And interestingly, I've already noticed that the runtimes listed for chapter 2 are significantly shorter. Apparently, chapter 2 is only supposed to be about 150 some odd minutes, so it's already more like 2 hours and 35 minutes long, as opposed to 3 hours 1 minute, which again goes back to the point I was making, that it would have been a better idea to make more focused, shorter films that stood on their own but had linking points that they built on one another, and you built your audience as you go along. But it'll be really interesting to see where we go in chapter 2, because it's possible chapter 2 will improve upon the issues in chapter 1, or not have any of them. We simply don't know. But from the glimpses in the ill-advised random montage that closes out chapter 1, I think it's just going to be more of the same, but with a faster pace and more action, because all of the setup of the storylines has been gotten out of the way in a massive 3-hour film that's just a mess. If you think about the runtime, this is longer than The Godfather. This is longer than Once Upon a Time in the West, which ironically actually does what Costner is trying to do. If you look at the thematics of Once Upon a Time in the West, and why it's so legendary, and why it has such staying power and such significance, it's talking about the birth, the building of the West, and the death of the frontier, and really the passage of time, and how all of human endeavor eventually will be buried in the sand and forgotten, whether other generations acknowledge it or not. It's just going to be lost to time. That's the natural order of things, and that makes that film hit you like a load of bricks every single time by the ending. It is so incredibly powerful, and it's doing all of that while focusing on individual characters and telling their stories from different perspectives, but it all feels unified. And, depending on which cut of the film you're looking at, and unfortunately none of the Paramount versions are complete or correct, but it's, around 165 to 170 minutes long. And think about the scope of Once Upon a Time in the West and what themes it's dealing with. It's the same themes as Horizon that Costner is trying to do across 4 gigantic films, but this first film is already longer than Once Upon a Time in the West, longer than The Godfather. And you think about just trying to think about how much of a plot chapter 1 has, and it doesn't have enough to fulfill a 3-hour film. Again, the Western is probably the genre that most needs narrative drive, focus, and energy. And I think there are so many great examples of some of the most iconic Westerns that underline this strongly. But even if you are into Golden Age radio and you listen to a classic Lone Ranger episode, those are, if you take out especially the musical interludes and the break, they're 29 minutes, but there's maybe 21 to 23 minutes of actual story material, or maybe 25 minutes. And those are brilliantly exciting, timeless examples of great Westerns. And it's all due to the snap and the drive of the story that's involving. Most of the masterpiece Western films are not exceptionally long. And then you think about the budget and the scale and the runtime that Costner's playing around with, and you're just like, what would happen if John Ford had gotten that? what would happen? What would have happened if any of the greats had gotten that? How many films would they have made for that amount of production value? How many John Ford masterpieces would we have gotten if he had gotten $100 million? Or what would we have gotten if John Ford had gotten to do just a big 3-hour epic, let alone multiple films? It's just, what would Anthony Mann have done with that? What would Howard Hawks have done with that? And most of all, what would Bud Boetticher have done with that? Bud Boetticher, who along with Burt Kennedy and Randolph Scott and Harry Joe Brown on the renowned cycle of Westerns, made some of the most achingly beautiful, perfect for examples of the genre that anybody has ever done. They're all works of art. They're all under 80 minutes long. They were all done as B films, shot in beautiful natural locations. All you have to do is look at Seven Men from Now, the first of the major cycle. This is only 78 minutes long. It was done as a B film. It's one of the greatest Westerns ever made, and it has such a potency. This is one of those films that has such a purity to it that if it was possible to hang a film on the wall of an art museum, this is one of those absolutely perfect films in every aspect of its execution and its impact, and it's such a perfect example of the genre. The renowned Westerns are really the best distillation of the entirety of the Western, I think. But there's such a there's almost a poetic quality to how incredibly powerful and distilled and focused the renowned Westerns are, that it's really interesting to study the art form and see the things that we've lost. A film doesn't have to be long or quote-unquote epic to truly be epic. Seven Men from Now and the rest of the renowned cycle are epic films, even though they're B films made for very little money, all under 80 minutes long. Seven Men from Now is 78 minutes. The mind boggles at how many masterpieces that the same team could have done with $100 million. Or how many films would Bud Boetticher have made for that? How much more could we have in terms of masterpiece westerns? So again, with Horizon, the concept, the somebody actually stepping up to the plate and doing this, it's beyond admirable. That's the draw. That's why we're going. That's why we want this to succeed. But it's not helping your case when the first film is, frankly, a gigantic hot mess. And here I am over a week later, and I'm still trying to process it. And I'm still wanting to pick up the UHD and watch it again just to see the technical presentation actually properly done, which I'm having to do at home. But also, I'm just still trying to process this because, again, it's quite baffling in how all of this was put together. There's nothing quite like this in terms of a precedent. It's really quite unique. But again, it's doing things that we just don't get in modern releases or studio releases or tent poles, which also is extraordinarily admirable. And people have already linked this to Francis Ford Coppola coming out with Megalopolis and it being his passion project and him putting roughly, I think, supposedly it's like $100 million into it and mortgaging everything he had, just like Costner did for this. So you've got two giant names doing at least something similar, and even if that film is a mess or terrible or whatever, you can't take that away from it. So it's incredibly admirable, and so it earns that sort of audience goodwill. So essentially, what I'm saying is, for every good decision or element in Horizon, there's about 10 or 15 or maybe 20 things that leave you scratching your head or are just not good or at the same level or frankly bad choices or decisions, but it's a very perplexing film. I keep coming back to, I think, how the production was handled for this iteration that's come to fruition. I think it was very ill-advised. I don't think the structure is good at all. again, it remains to be seen where we're going with all of this in Chapter 2, but with Chapter 1's very limited audience, very low and poor box office performance so far, what the industry and the trade papers and the online discourse has been focusing on really shows that the movie itself is the least important to most people. The stories are the production and the budget and the 4-film plan and Costner putting his own money in more than is the film any good or not. Can somebody make a great Western and actually have box office success in 2024 and reinvigorate the genre? Does this need to be a streaming series instead? Or people are looking at Costner's exit from Yellowstone instead of the film itself, which should be the focus. So this is a film I recommend people to see honestly, simply to study it, to study the whole experience and the production and see what you make of it. Also to see what your local theaters are actually like for presentation quality and see if you have a similar experience to me, how that affects your film experience. It's a film that I want people to go and support just to support this type of endeavor, but I don't think the film itself actually warrants that. So it's a very strange predicament. It's another aspect of this that it's really unprecedented. Of you're wanting to support the work on the front end, just the idea of the enterprise, even if the actual final product is not worth it. But again, modern chain theaters across the country are so abominably poor that I actually would recommend people to get the UHD, to wait for seeing it at home, because even with an average 4K television, you're going to have a better experience and better presentation quality and experience the intent of the film far better than 99% of chain theaters across the country, which is just crazy, but that's the world we live in. So I want the films to be successful. I hope he's able to finish all 4 of them. I don't know if that's going to be possible. It might be that they have to just tie everything up in Chapter 3 if they can finish it. And I do think, unfortunately, Chapter 2 is going to have much less of an audience draw and an even lower box office performance, just judging by how Chapter 1 has gone and how off-putting it is to a great amount of the audience. So again, it's rather unlikely that we're actually going to see this whole thing finished. One hopes that it does get finished, but that's another reason why I would encourage people to go see it and support this endeavor and see what you think. I mean, yes, it's a 3-hour film, so technically you certainly get your money's worth, and there are good moments scattered throughout, mostly the subtle ones. And somebody making a 3-hour Western and trying to make 3 more, it's not something you expected to see in 2024, especially for us Western geeks. So, anybody makes a Western, I feel like I have to go and support it and just go see it to support the genre. But it's such an odd experience that I recommend seeing it to support the endeavor and to see what you make of it, because again, it's everything it's doing is rather unprecedented, and I think it's actually showing even more how the industry is shifting, and there are no more boundaries between the different mediums. So hopefully you have a better theatrical experience than I did if you see the film in theaters, and I would love to hear everyone's thoughts on the film and their theater-going experience and about the presentation quality if you've already seen Chapter 1 or plan on seeing it. So if you have any thoughts on the film or your experience with it, or thoughts about the upcoming chapters in development, please leave your thoughts in the comments below. Again, this is merely my own reflections on seeing Horizon: An American Saga Chapter 1, and it's just such a perplexing film in production, and has so many unprecedented elements that I keep thinking about it. It keeps percolating in my mind. I keep chewing it over and just questioning why a lot. That's the question I keep coming back to. Why did they do this? Why did they do this way? Why did they shoot it this way? Why did they have such a short production schedule for such a big film? Why the insistence on the 4 chapters endeavors and why the mixing of the story. I just keep coming back to why. I wake up in the middle of the night and think of something, or I'm in the shower and I'm thinking about Horizon. Once again, going why. It's been a long time since I've had a film make me have so many why questions, and again, it's such a peculiar and odd experience, but you still want it to succeed. That's the thing. So even if you hate the film, I think you come away thinking just how impressive and bold and daring the whole enterprise is, but that doesn't necessarily make a good movie, nor does it help the enterprise if your first movie is a 3-hour mess in a lot of ways with a very limited audience to begin with. So again, it's a very hard sell for most people, but I do encourage people to view the film, to just support the effort and just to study it, because I think this is a film that and project that needs to be studied just to try and understand what was going on in people's heads and what exactly they were going after, because again, we've never seen anything quite like this before. So as always, please do keep supporting film endeavors such as this, and good theaters if you are lucky enough to have a good theater in your area, by going and purchasing your tickets, or purchasing digital versions in the home, or of course supporting the physical media release on the UHD from Warner Brothers, which will be coming out soon, which of course is the best way to experience the film, because it's going to be far better than the average terrible theater presentations, and give you the benefit of 4K HDR10 and the Dolby Atmos mix. So I'll be picking that up and revisiting the film and seeing if I can reevaluate it just by seeing a proper presentation, unlike what AMC would give you. So as always, please do keep supporting films and releases of note by buying tickets and buying physical media releases in order to help keep both movie theaters and physical media releases and film culture itself alive. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.